first of all, thanks to Aryeh Lesh and to the Lesh family, and to Barry Zattel for chairing this. Thank you to our guests. We talk about Jewish values sometimes as if they're like this amorphous thing that exists only on paper. But Jewish values are only as valuable as we decide to bring them into the world. We, in our experience as a people, as I spoke about at length on yesterday, and I encourage you to go see the sermon as soon as it's posted on our YouTube channel, we as a people, we are a people of refugees. We are a people of wandering and of displacement. And we've created organizations like JIAS and HIAS originally to help us and our people settle into these lands, being Canada and the United States, during the times of the pogroms, when even my grandfather, who I spoke about yesterday, at the age of 5 years old, had to hide in a hay cart in order to escape over the Russian border from the Cossacks, who were pitchforking the hay to make sure that the Jews weren't getting out. And of course, to the horrors of the Holocaust. I mean, this is all of our story. The Torah says more times than any other mitzvah, be careful the way in which you treat the stranger, because you were strangers in a strange land, referring to Egypt. And if we're going to take that seriously, then that means that when we have been privileged to settle successfully in places like Canada, yes, first and foremost, there are still Jews around the world that are in need of rescue. We have an obligation, Kol Yisrael Arvim Ze B'Zeh, all of Israel is responsible one for another in order to get those Jews to safety. But we also understand, living in free democratic societies, that we have an obligation to help all people who are suffering, who are in need of rescue, to get to safety. And so I couldn't be prouder of Beth Tzedek for both having sponsored a Syrian family 4 years ago, and then having the courage to step up and work to bring another family here to Canada through JIAS, to raise the money that's necessary to do that, which is not a small amount of money. It was $50,000, but we did it, thanks to everyone's generosity. But even more importantly, to know that it's not just the money, it's like adopting the family and helping them to acculturate and acclimate and find their way in this new land. I hope we'll be able to bring this family here soon, to reunite them as a family in Canada, and to celebrate this tremendous accomplishment and this Jewish value, not just words on a parchment or on a paper, but words that we put into practice. So kol hakavod to everyone for participating, that kol hakavod for everyone for being here. And I look forward to hearing about Dawit and his family, and the experience of the family that we're bringing to Canada in partnership with JIAS. It's a pleasure to welcome Elise Herzig, who is the executive director of HIAS, or of JIAS rather, to be here with us. Elise, do you have a few words of welcome that you want to say?
Yes, thank you, Rabbi, for your beautiful words. And Yaakov, thank you for inviting me. And it's okay if you confuse HIAS and JIAS, because my dad was on the executive of HIAS for over 2 decades. So they are interchangeable in my family. But I really have the rare privilege of being the executive director of JIAS Toronto. It's an organization that's been around for close to 100 years. We're also very blessed to have a number of members of the Beth Tzedek community on our board, and dozens more in terms of our army of volunteers that help us do our work on a day-to-day basis. JIAS was started close to 100 years ago to welcome Jewish refugees that were fleeing Europe, exactly as you said, Rabbi, religious persecution, and they were leaving so they could be Jews in another country and practice their religion. And over the decades, we have helped thousands of Jews come from different countries, whether it's Hungary, Morocco, Holocaust survivors, the former Soviet Union. And today, JIAS continues to help build a strong Jewish community, but we also help newcomers from other countries, including refugees. JIAS Toronto is the only agency, social service agency in Canada, the only Jewish one, that has actually a sponsorship agreement holder status, which means that we partner with the federal government and we can help privately sponsor refugees. And we are so honored, delighted, and humbled by the work that the Beth Tzedek community does with us on a daily basis. And just like we're partners of the federal government, Beth Tzedek and his community is partners with JIAS in terms of our work. The volunteerism, the dollars raised, the incredible advocacy work done by the Beth Tzedek community is inspirational not only to the team at JIAS, but to the Toronto Jewish community and to other Canadians. This is a subject near and dear to my heart. These are my dad's refugee papers for him coming to Canada in 1952. This is his immigration identification card from the Canadian government. And this is from the United Nations that declares my father as a refugee. And that is why my father for decades worked on the highest board, because my father said one of the greatest gifts you can give to a newcomer is to help them belong. And belonging is a very special feeling. And I think that's what the mitzvah, why it's said so many times in the Torah, it's very difficult to help someone belong. But when you warmly welcome them, when your community comes together, even during a pandemic, to meet our refugees in their driveways and bring them books for their children to read, picking up groceries for them, or even phone call, just giving them that phone call to say that they're not alone. Really, the Beth Tzedek community is, it's like Yasem Min HaKlalis. It's really reaching, it goes beyond the expectation, but it really is a role model for all of us in our community. So I don't want to take away from today's guest speakers, but I just want to thank Beth Tzedek for the opportunity to thank you today, to participate today, and to be able to acknowledge the incredible work synagogue is doing, and in particular with the bus group we have. So I'm going to pass it on to David and to Dawit. Thank you.
Okay, great. Rabbi Steve and Elise and Yaakov, thank you so much. Hello, everyone. My name is David Zarnett. I am a political scientist from the University of Toronto. It's my pleasure to be here to speak with Dawit Demoz about such important topics regarding displacement, refugees, and resettlement. Today, if you look at all available data, humanity is experiencing probably one of the most severe refugee and displacement crises in modern history. Let me just read off a few important statistics. Today, there are more than 80 million people who have been forcibly displaced from their homes, fleeing persecution, conflict, violence, and human rights violations. This number has doubled since 2010. 40% of the 80 million are under the age of 18. This means 30 to 34 million kids. 80% of these 80 million, this is 64 million people, of the 80 million displaced currently live in poor or low-income countries that have weak or non-existent healthcare systems and suffer acute food insecurity and malnutrition. So the lives of these 80 million people are characterized by extreme fear, violence, insecurity, uncertainty, hunger, family separation, and a significant dependence on international aid. Now, the problem with describing this current crisis in the way I just have, using numbers, statistics, is that it offers us a rather sanitized view of what is currently taking place. There's a good chance that when I read off things like 80 million or 34 million or 64 million, that these terms didn't evoke much in you. Research in psychology has a good explanation for this based on the term psychic numbing, that when all of us are confronted with images or depictions of mass suffering, the tendency is to look away, to shut off our emotions, and to remain inactive or indifferent. So it's with this in mind that Dawit and I wanted to have a conversation about the lived realities of the life of a refugee through his own lived experience, fleeing violent persecution in Eritrea and Ethiopia just over a decade ago. We want to get beyond the numbers and statistics to give you deeper insights into what it actually means to be a refugee. What is this kind of existence like? What does it mean to be forced to leave your home and to live a life characterized by severe uncertainty, danger, dependence, and exclusion? And what can we in the audience do to help those living this kind of life? So it's a real honor for me today to introduce Dawit and to be able to speak with him about his journey. Today, Dawit is a graduate student at York University, where he's an emerging expert on the topics of forced migration and refugee resettlement. He also currently works at the Ontario office of the Refugee Sponsorship Training Program. Just a few months ago, I'm excited to say Dawit became a Canadian citizen, so a big mazel tov to Dawit. Tragically, however, his family remains stuck in East Africa, caught up in a violent conflict that has spiraled out of control since November, displacing and killing thousands of civilians. So Dawit, I want to thank you again for speaking with us and me today. Dawit, you were born and raised in Eritrea, a country that probably most of us don't know a lot about. Maybe some of us have never even heard of it before. The first question I'd ask you is, can you tell us a bit about this country? What is Eritrea all about? And what was your life like there growing up as a kid?
Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Betzedek and Jayas and everyone who's involved in helping refugees. I'll share this screen that will help us visually look at where Eritrea is. So I'm going to talk about the situation in Tigray now and how my family and many other refugees are in a very precarious situation. But before that, Eritrea, as you can see, is a relatively small country on the coast of Red Sea. Before 1991, Eritrea used to be part of Ethiopia. Again, it's a historical debate that some claim that it was colonized by Ethiopia, but never part of Ethiopia. But for today's argument, we can just say that Eritrea was part of Ethiopia until 1991. In the 1960s, when Ethiopia was controlled by, including Eritrea, by a dictator from the Amhara region of Ethiopia. So Ethiopia is divided into 10 ethnic-based regions, and Amhara is the second populous region, as you can see in the image. And so up until 1991, the dictators from the Amhara community controlled Ethiopia and Eritrea. And to defeat against this authoritarian regime in Ethiopia, including Eritrea, Eritrean rebel groups and from the Tigray region of Ethiopia started a guerrilla struggle to defeat the Mengistu Haile Mariam regime in Ethiopia. So in 1991, these two rebel groups from Eritrea and from the Tigray region in cooperation removed the dictatorial regime in Ethiopia, and Eritrea became independent country. So in 1991, Eritrea became independent. In 1993, Eritrea became member of the United Nations. So since then, Eritrea is independent, but the rebels from the Tigray region, who in cooperation with the Ethiopian rebels, removed the Mengistu Haile Mariam regime in Ethiopia and became, created a coalition government that became the more influential group. Even though they are only 6% of the Ethiopian population, they dominated the Ethiopian politics up until 2008. So I'll talk about it in a little bit, but to talk about Eritrea, the entire world was hopeful about Eritrea because their movement was incredible in Ethiopia. The Mengistu regime at that time was supported by the United States, the USSR, and many other actors, big actors. But despite all this support, the Eritrean and the Tigray TPLF guerrilla warfare won, and it was a big story in the world. And we as Eritreans, and I was born 4 years before the independence, so I have a very vivid memory of the freedom fighters coming to Eritrea and the Eritrean people coming to the streets and enjoying the moment. But unfortunately, the very popular rebel in Eritrea turned out to be one of the worst dictatorships in the world. It's called nowadays a North Korea of Africa. Since 1991, we have never had any elections. There is only one party regime that's controlled the entire country, no multi-party, no freedom of press, no freedom of movement. If you're under the age of 50, you cannot have a passport and leave the country legally. And in 1998, the two rebel groups who removed the Ethiopian dictator in 1991 fought within themselves in 1998, again, because there was a power dynamics that led them into war. And in 1998, a war that took 2 years and that took about 100,000 lives, ended in 2000. The TPLF, who at that time was ruling Ethiopia, defeated the Eritrean government, not only militarily, but also politically. And since then, Eritrea became a very isolated country. And with the excuse of another attack coming from Ethiopia, the Eritrean government militarized the entire country. And so since 1995, the Eritrean government introduced mandatory national conscription, military conscription. And young Eritreans who finish high school goes to the army and they stay there pretty much forever. And this indefinite slavery-like condition led hundreds of thousands of Eritreans to leave Eritrea since 2001. So the UNHCR estimates 525,000 Eritreans left, but many other Eritreans who are not registered by UNHCR also left Eritrea. So up to 1 million out of only 4 million country are in diaspora now. And myself and my parents and my entire family at this point were also victims of the situation in Eritrea and were forced to leave Eritrea.
Thanks, Dawit. You mentioned something interesting about Eritrea being the North Korea of Africa. It's a really interesting way to put it. Growing up under those conditions, what's that like? Do you have any sort of vivid memories of your childhood? What it was like to sort of be a kid under such repressive conditions?
Absolutely, yeah. So like I said, I was born in 1986, just 4 years or 5 years before independence. And I have a very vivid memory of the soldiers, the military from the Ethiopian dictatorial regime at that time. But my most memories are from the freedom fighters coming to Eritrea and the Eritrean people, enjoying the freedom and being very, very hopeful of the future of Eritrea. And for me, the first 4 or 5 years until Eritrea and Ethiopia went into war again in 1998, that was probably the best moment. Was as a child, I was hopeful. I had hopes. I started school in 1994 in the region, very remote region that I was born. There was no school, there was no education at all at that time. And in '94, I got registered grade 1. I remember my dad, he has never been to school. He's not educated man, but he's a very talented man, and he was interested into politics and journalism. So he influenced me to be interested, to have interest in journalism. So, you know, as an elementary student, I've always wanted to be a journalist. Unfortunately, Eritrea turned out to be the worst country to be a journalist. It's in the top by arresting journalists in the world today. And so the dream changed in 1998 when the war broke out. We were the first, because the region I was born is on the border with Ethiopia. So we were the first to be impacted by the war. We were displaced in the early days of the war. And pretty much we've been displaced with my family until the days I left. So my hope to be a journalist was pretty much evaporated by the Eritrean government controlling my entire life. In 2005, I was forced to go to the national service. I spent 2 years in the national service, and I was forced to go to a very high political course to be a very loyal of the Eritrean government, pretty much to spy on my family and my friends. And you know, since 2005, since the age of 19, my life was controlled not by me, but by the Eritrean government. So the memories I have after the age of 19 are memories of fear, memories of oppression, memories of no future, and uncertainty, unfortunately.
So you mentioned things change. So from 1990, you leave Eritrea in 2009. From 1998, you mentioned, so up until that point, you're feeling hopeful for Eritrea's future. In that period from 1998 to 2009, before the decision to leave, was there discussion of leaving? Was that a sudden thing? Was this part of the discourse within your family of what are we going to do? Is our future viable here? Can you walk us through? So how does that decision come about in yourself and in your sort of social context?
So unfortunately, in Eritrea, when family members leave, the rest of the family gets punished. So there is no discussion between family members. And in 2015, the UN Commission of Inquiry on Eritrea nicely summed up the situation in Eritrea when they said Eritrea is ruled by fear and not by law. So the country is militarized. The highest budget of the government goes into the military and to intelligence. So it was in a moment where family members and siblings could not trust each other. And so if you say anything to your family member could be forced to spy on you and to tell your plans about you. So there was no discussion at all. There is no discussion. I've never heard until today any young Eritrean who said, I told my family that I was going to leave. Unfortunately, it's very risky. You know, let alone you tell them you're going to leave. People are tortured and arrested for thinking. They're accused of thinking of leaving Eritrea. Like, are you in my mind? Like, how do you even know that I'm thinking about it? So there is no discussion, unfortunately. And the trigger for me was by the end of that political improvement course. I realized what was the expectation of me. I realized what my future was. I realized how in a very risky and sensitive situation I was going to put myself, because the more secret you know about the atrocities of the Eritrean government is committing, the more danger it is for yourself. So I just didn't want to be in that situation. Despite the Eritrean government's shoot to kill policy for people who try to leave, I still chose to leave Eritrea, and I didn't tell anybody. I didn't tell my mom, I didn't tell my dad or anyone, and I just decided to have another pair of clothes on me, not even having a backpack or anything. I didn't want to look like a suspicious person, so I just put another pair of clothes on me, and one night just decided to leave Eritrea to Ethiopia.
Wow. So Dawit, I want to sort of learn more about that journey out of Eritrea. But maybe I could pick up on one thing you mentioned, that that there is a movement of people out of Eritrea. There's a growing diaspora, but I think the overwhelming majority of people stay, right? Because the decision to leave is so fraught with peril. What was unique? What do you think, looking back, if you do a sort of a bit of like sort of analyzing yourself, your own psychology, what was unique about you that propelled you out of the country, while most other people of your age, I assume, probably would have made sort of the cost benefit decision of it's a really challenging existence here, but I'm better off staying given the uncertainty of leaving. What was unique about you that sort of propelled you out of the country?
Well, I wouldn't say that was unique about me. And unfortunately, when we say 1 million out of 4 million left in 20 years, that's not a small number. So if it's not because it's too risky to leave, many young Eritreans are now leaving. Up until the so-called peace agreement with Ethiopia in 2018, as you see on the screen, in the timeline that shows how things changed in Ethiopia. And so since 2018, when the TPLF were not in power anymore, when they were replaced by a very popular leader who is half from the Oromo, the highest population in Ethiopia, and half Amhara. And when the TPLF was decided to go back to their region and not in control of the situation in Ethiopia, the number of Eritrean refugees coming to Ethiopia drastically reduced, because the Eritrean government had access to Ethiopia and to slow down the situation. But up until then, up to 5,000 Eritreans were leaving every month, young Eritreans. So the only situation that even limited the number is the very strict border policy in Eritrea, and the shoot to kill policy. And of course, many Eritreans were killed at the border trying to escape.
Dawit, so what was that escape like? How do you actually escape? You said you just had another pair of clothes. What were you carrying? Can you walk us a bit through that journey?
So I was carrying nothing. Like I said, I couldn't tell my family. I couldn't think anything. I couldn't carry anything that would make me, a little bit of suspicious. And so the only thing that I had on me is a pair of clothes, and it was at night. For me, because like I said, I was born at the border with Tigray, so it took me a few hours of walking on foot, to cross the border. And on the other side, there were the Ethiopian military who welcomed me and took me to a refugee camp. And just to quickly show you another slide, I know I'm going to remove this. I'm going to unshare my screen, but this is the map again. And as you can see on the right side of the picture, there are 4 refugee camps where about 100,000 Eritrean refugees were living, and some of them still living there. And I'll explain a little bit of how the war broke out between Eritrea and the Tigray region a little bit, but these are the 4 refugee camps, and the Mai Aini, one of the 2, not on the Eritrean border, but on the Amhara border, the Mai Aini refugee camp is where I spent about 3 or 4 months. And at that point, I realized that the refugee camp was a very remote area, and there was no freedom of movement. I couldn't leave the refugee camp, and there was no hope. One of the reasons that I left Eritrea and I wanted to have a future is to have the opportunity to go to school. And unfortunately, in 2009, when I was there, Ethiopia was not allowing refugees to have the opportunity of higher education. And so I decided to leave the refugee camp, and I went to Sudan, and from Sudan to Libya. I want to go to Europe, and unfortunately at that time, there was an agreement between the Italians and Gaddafi, so there was no way to jump on a risky boat and try to go to Europe. So I had to go back to Egypt and cross to Israel. So that's the journey I ended up taking to Israel. But to just talk about the situation of refugees in Ethiopia. So like I said, between 2000 and 2018, there was a no peace, no war situation between Eritrea and Ethiopia. But when the TPLF, who ruled the politics in Ethiopia, were cited in 2018, and a new leader came into the Ethiopian politics, the Eritrean and Ethiopian governments agreed to have a so-called peace deal in 2018. So in 2018, there was this peace deal, and the new government didn't like the way the TPLF ruled Ethiopia for the past 27 years. So partnered with the Eritrean government, who is the enemy of the TPLF, to isolate TPLF. And so an Ethiopian government in Ethiopia partnered with the foreign government in Eritrea to punish the TPLF, the guerrilla group who helped remove the dictatorial regime in '91 and led the country for the past 27 years. And the TPLF didn't like the way the new Ethiopian government was partnering with a foreign enemy government, and they resisted the change the Ethiopian government was making. And eventually that led into war. And when the new government of Ethiopia and the old government of Ethiopia went into war, the new government of Ethiopia invited the Eritrean government to help them defeat the TPLF. And the war is ongoing now. The Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International reported that thousands of civilians were killed by the Eritrean government and the federal government in Ethiopia in the Tigray region. And the 100,000 refugees, Eritrean refugees who are stuck in this war are also in a very precarious situation. On one hand, the Eritrean government, the government that they escaped from, is now in the same region where they are living, and they are kidnapping refugees back to Eritrea and killing. And many have been displaced from the refugee camp and dispersed. Some went to Sudan, some went to the capital, Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. And my family are in this really terrible situation. On one hand, the Eritrean government is there. On the other hand, the Ethiopian government is not providing any protection and not allowing the United Nations and any other humanitarian organizations to have access to the Tigray region at this moment.
Dawit, I'm just filled with questions. Your story is fascinating, and there's so many things I want to ask you. Maybe I'll throw two questions in. We have a lot to cover, so maybe I'll just ask you two questions at the same time. You mentioned that in Eritrea, the conversation, there's no conversation about whether you were leaving or not. You couldn't talk about it. So logistically, how do you know where to go? If no one talks about, like, how do you know what roads to take? How do you know how to avoid the Eritrean troops? How do you know, how did you know what to do? How did you know how to get out? And the second thing is, what was life like for you in the Ethiopian camp? You said you were welcomed by the Ethiopian troops. Can you walk us a bit through, if you want, if you feel comfortable, the emotions of that. Were you hopeful? Were you scared? What was that like?
Yeah, so one of the ways that the Ethiopian government at that time, during the time that I left Eritrea, that weakened the Eritrean government is by welcoming Eritrean refugees and by providing them the opportunities of resettlement. One hand, to be in a refugee camp and to be safe and, not having to worry about your life and not being a slave of your commanders in the national service. And so we as Eritreans knew that Eritreans who left to Ethiopia were welcomed by the Ethiopian government and provided a basic needs, kind of needs that keeps you alive, but not providing more than a survival assistance. So for me, like I said, because the village I was born is on the border with Tigray, I knew the movements of the military at the border, but also I had family members on the other side, because at some point before the war, we were families, we were friends with our neighbors. And so I had family members on the other side who knew my family. And when I crossed the border, I was welcomed by the military, but they allowed me to greet my relatives, and they gave me some money, and that was hopeful for me, that at least I was safe. Nobody was coming after me. But after spending 3-4 months at the refugee camp, I realized that I might be safe. I might not be, dead here, but I don't have any future. I won't have the opportunity for education, for a better life. I won't be able to help my family who I left behind. And so that was the incentive or the trigger that pushed me to leave the refugee camp and to find a better place elsewhere.
And that sort of leads you to, initially, as you mentioned, to try to get to Europe through Libya. That path was blocked for, I guess, a number of reasons, and you end up going through the Sinai to Israel. That must have been an incredibly complicated and traumatizing journey for you. To what extent do you want to talk about it? And then what was your life like in Israel? It's also a very complicated, complex society. What was your experience like?
Yeah. Again, escaping from a government that controls your entire life, and yet handing your life to smugglers who also controls your life and can do anything to you. These human smugglers, they have no faith. Their only faith is money. And if you don't give them the money they ask you on time, they can kill you and throw you in the desert. And I've witnessed many people being thrown at the deserts or being killed because they were not able to provide the amount of money that were asked to provide. Fortunately, I was not one of the people who left at the desert. I was able to provide the money that I was asked. When I left Eritrea, when I was in Sudan, especially, I was able to connect back with my family. That was the time that my family heard what I was and what I was planning. And through a black market, they were able to send me some money, and some relatives from Europe and in Ethiopia, extended family members who were living in Ethiopia were also able to add some money for my journey. And I was glad, now that I am here, that I am safe, that I'm not in a fight and flight moment. I start having emotions, and so talking about my experience in the journey to Israel, triggers so many memories that I have been neglecting, that I have been denying to talk about. But I was lucky to be one of the people who made it to Israel, despite the traumatic situation. There were moments that I thought I was going to die. I wasn't going to make it when we were thrown in the Sahara Desert between Sudan and Libya, and when the Libyan smugglers were not coming to pick us up. But fortunately, I made it. And the only hope that kept me alive in this journey is that I'm going to make it one day, and I'm going to have the opportunity to go to school and to educate myself and to help my family in any way I can. And like I said, I was one of the few lucky ones who made it to Israel.
And when you arrived in Israel, I know in previous conversations, I mean, what's so fascinating about your story is that theme of it. The hope is like it keeps coming back. Like maybe you're an eternal optimist at heart. What was it? Were you confident you could stay in Israel? I mean, you're fluent in Hebrew, or you were, or maybe your Hebrew is rusty now, but I mean, you're fully integrated in many ways. What happened there? What was that like? I know at some point you were just sort of dropped off in South Tel Aviv and had to sleep in parks for a few nights or for a few weeks. What was that? What was that initial time like for you? And then we'll talk a bit about your transition to Canada.
Yeah, so I crossed on the night of October 6, 2009. I remember, that moment every day. And many from the group who tried to cross the Egyptian border to Israel were shot by the Egyptian army and killed, and some were injured. And so growing up, I've heard about Israel. I didn't know about the politics and the history, but growing up, I've heard the word Israel almost every day because my mom is religious, and she prays, and she always says, "Oh, the God of Israel," "Oh, Amlake Israel" in Tigrinya. And so I was hopeful. Growing up, I've known that Israel is a holy place. It's the place of God. And I was extremely optimistic that Israel was going to be my final destination. And I think I had that hope up until 2014. And in 2014, just to give you a little bit backstory until 2014. So that night I crossed the border, an Israeli military welcomed us, and they took us to prison. I was in prison for about 3 months, and after 3 months, I was released and sent to South Tel Aviv, where I joke about the bus driver dropped me in the one of the biggest bus terminals probably in the world, and it took me about 3 hours to find my way out from that bus terminal to go to a park to find myself in a park in South Tel Aviv. And with no support from anyone, with not knowing anything about the culture and the country, I started my life. And about a month after I lived in Israel, I found a job working in an aluminium company, and my boss wanted to speak English because I spoke English at that point. Fairly well, and he asked me to speak in English for 4 days, and every Thursday we spoke in Hebrew. And after about 3 months, my Hebrew was way better than his English, and he said, "You know what? Forget about English. Let's speak in Hebrew." So that helped me to really improve my Hebrew and to learn about the culture and to advocate for myself and my fellow refugees in Israel. And in 2014, we had a protest of 30,000 refugees coming out of the streets of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, where we demanded a better life and recognition in Israel. But after that movement was collapsed, I realized that my hope was not in Israel. I had to find another way to go somewhere else to find a better place. And luckily enough, while I was working in the refugee organizations and advocating for the rights of myself and my fellow refugees, I was able to meet a person who I call now a dear friend. Not only am I a dear friend to her, but a family to her family in Toronto and in Winnipeg. So I was able to meet Samara in Tel Aviv, who went from here to volunteer at one of the refugee organizations. And when she came back to Canada, I asked her if she could sponsor me, and she did. And so I was privately sponsored to Canada in 2016. And it's been almost 5 years now. And I'm proud to say that Elise encouraged me to show my papers. I'm proud to say that I'm a Canadian citizen and holding a Canadian passport, holding a passport for the first time in my life. And it feels good.
Dawit, so to get from Israel to Canada, you moved through so something unique to Canada is the private sponsorship program, and you are an expert in this because you train as part of your work now, and I'm sure it's part of your graduate work at York. You train, I guess, individuals, organizations, families to sponsor refugees. How did private sponsorship work for you? How does it work? Why is it unique to Canada? Can you tell us a bit about how that sort of system works?
Yeah. So community sponsorship exists in other countries as well, in the UK, in Ireland, in other countries. But the private sponsorship, where private citizens can sponsor refugees from abroad, is very unique to Canada. Only in Canada can private citizens sponsor refugees from everywhere in the world, pretty much. And my introduction to private sponsorship was when I asked Samara if she could sponsor me, and when I started my process, pretty much. And I was privately sponsored. And when I came here, I didn't just, come here and not do anything about the people I left behind. So I wanted to encourage other people to sponsor my fellow refugees back in Israel and elsewhere. And I was able to meet, I saw Danny in this group. I met Danny Schild in 2017, and with Danny and other individuals from the Jewish community, in cooperation and partnership with them, I started advocating about the private sponsorship. So I learned so much about the private sponsorship and how unique it is. And when I start university, I start researching about it as well, and I start working with my supervisor, who is also an expert in that area. And so private sponsorship, there are three ways. One is there are organizations and institutions who have an agreement with the Canadian government to bring refugees from elsewhere. So the government gives them a certain number of spots every year, and they bring refugees from abroad. And JAIAS is one of these organizations. I think Ellis talked about it. And other ways, there is a group of five where 5 private citizens can mobilize resources and sponsor refugees directly from abroad. And I think the Bet Tzedek community is the refugee committee in Bet Tzedek is very familiar with the process, because they have been sponsoring refugees through that avenue. And so that's very unique. Up to 20,000 refugees come every year through this avenue. It's been delayed because of the COVID situation. That's why I'm very worried about my family now, even though they are in process to come to Canada. Because of the involvement of the Eritrean government in Ethiopia, their security situation is very, very concerning. And the Eritrean government is encouraging the Ethiopian government to not give exit visas to refugees who have had the opportunity to be resettled to Canada. And the COVID situation is slowing down the process. But I'm hopeful that one day my family will be joining me here in Canada as well.
So Dawit, to those in the audience, to myself, to all of us in the audience, what are some sort of practical things we can do to support you, people like your family, other refugees? Like I said at the outset, there's 80 million forcibly displaced people around the world. And those who live in societies like we do have some degree of responsibility, especially given the history of sort of displacement and within the Jewish community. What are some practical things that you would suggest all of us do today, over the next few weeks, or think about over the next few months to help individuals and families like your own?
Yeah. To hear 80 million refugees are in desperate need of help, I think it's easy to feel discouraged by the number, to say, oh, wow, like, what am I going to do? That's a huge number. And, I'm just an individual or, a congregation, what are we going to do? But I think hearing my story and realizing where I was in just 5 years ago and where I am now and what kind of opportunities I have, I think looking at it on a very small scale, on a very personal, on a very humanistic perspective, even if you bring few refugee families to Canada, you're pretty much changing their life, bringing their life from upside down. And so if it wasn't for Samara and her family to bring me here, I wouldn't have had the future. I wouldn't have had a degree, 35 years old, 34 years old, with no degree, with no hope, with no future, living in a very precarious situation, in a very, in a fight and flight moment my entire life. So, seeing my situation now, coming from a very precarious situation and no hope and no future, having, to have a master's degree very soon and having the citizenship and the freedom, I think that's a huge thing that an individual or a refugee family can hope for. So if you can help the Beit Tzedek Refugee Committee in any way you can, being member of the group and helping them sponsor refugees, donating other material support or financial support, or partnering with other. I know so many people here that are not member of the Beit Tzedek Refugee Committee sponsor other people as well. So you can help those individuals and those groups. You can support Jayas, who's doing an incredible job to not only sponsor people, but to help them when they get here to have a smooth resettlement experience and settlement experience. And so, I'm here. So many people who are involved in helping refugees are here. You can get in touch with us and we can connect you with other refugees who are in a very desperate situation to come here, especially with the situation in Ethiopia now. Many Eritrean refugees are in a very desperate hope. Just today, a single mother of 3 whose husband was killed at the refugee camp just a month and a half ago, is now in a very desperate situation with no hope and not knowing what to do. And she called me and she asked me, like, can you help me with this? And, there are stories like this that, the audience here, and you can, of course, raise awareness about the situation and talk about it with your family members, with your network, and spread the word.
Dawit, so in many ways, you are by all objective indicators, you are a success story for private sponsorship. Do you feel like you belong in Canada? You are fully integrated, you are Canadian. Yes, you have the passport, but belonging is also an emotional state. How Canadian do you feel? And maybe what insights do you have about Canadian society that we who don't come from a direct refugee background might not know about?
Yeah. So it's important to remember that my success story is taken for granted by someone who was born here, who hasn't had that experience. For me, that's huge success story, because my life has been changed dramatically, and so for me, that's a success story. For many people who come here through that process is a success story, and it's incredible that the Canadian public, not only the government, but the public is invested in this situation, and they do, so much to not only bring here, but also to help them integrate it. But the feeling of belonging, I was 21 years old when I left Eritrea, and my every childhood memory is in Eritrea. It doesn't matter how difficult it was to live there, but it was a place that I called home. It's where my childhood is. It's where the culture that I adore. It's the weather that I love. I think is the most amazing weather in the world, at least in the places that I have been to. And so I miss so much. I miss my childhood memory, my childhood friends, and the culture, the collective culture that I miss so much. But I do feel Canadian. I do feel that I think Canada, despite, Canada is not perfect. There are so many things, so many people struggle, so many people with, background in education coming here, and the system being very difficult for them to recognize their credentials. Racism and anti-Black racism that we cannot deny. And so there are many things that Canada needs to work on, but I do feel Canadian, and I see myself living here and being part of this wonderful society and contributing in any way I can.
So I should say to the audience that we do have a few more minutes. I think it is 5, but if you do have some questions and you want to put them into the Zoom chat, I can do my best to integrate them into the conversation. Do we maybe just a few more questions, then we'll have to call it. You mentioned something interesting about the 80 million, the overwhelming nature of this issue, the challenges of feeling of integration and belonging. Something inside you must motivate you to keep doing what you're doing. You have a lived experience as a refugee. You're a grad student studying this issue. You work with private sponsorship initiatives. You must have days where you must throw your hands up and say, the government just imposed another set of restrictions, or there's a whole set of challenges occurring in Tigray that make your job and your life that much more difficult. What drives you? What motivates you? How do you keep going, doing this kind of work? And maybe what lessons can we learn from your own motivation in this regard?
Yeah, like sometimes when I reflect back, when I look at the things I do at the same time, and sometimes I feel like I'm doing a lot of things at the same time, and I'm not, perfecting one thing. I'm full-time in school. I'm working full-time now, and I'm trying my best to help others to come here. And so I think it's overwhelming. But part of the things that kept me sane and resilient is investing in trying to help others. I think that's the source of resilience. Sometimes I feel like if I'm being too selfish to do this to feel good about myself, or just to keep myself sane. But I think one of the things that really keeps me hopeful and resilient about the work I do, and of course the memory of the things that I've been through, is just being invested on this situation. Part of me feels guilty leaving Israel and leaving behind everybody, because in many ways I was one of the voices of the community while I was in Israel. But I had power, I had access, I had connection to Samara. And so many people who does not have that connection, who does not have link in Canada are still there. My family is lucky. They have me, and I'm using my connection, with the Jewish community and with other communities to bring my family here. But part of me feels, guilty that I'm not doing enough, that I'm not supporting other people, especially the people who does not have a connection to Canada and to people in Canada. So that's one of the things that I want to do more going forward, just to help people who does not have connection to Canada and who does not have other people who could do that for them.
Yeah, thanks, Dawit. That's inspirational. Maybe the last thing I'd ask you, and then we will have to probably end the event, is you mentioned a bit about your family. You mentioned how they're lucky to have you advocate on their behalf. Can you tell us a bit about what's their current situation? What have the last few days been like for them? To the extent you want to share, what can you tell us about their current situation?
Yeah, so it's a very concerning and very dangerous situation in Ethiopia now. The Eritrean government being, I would confidently say, in control of the Ethiopian politics. At this moment, intelligence officers, Eritrean intelligence officers are all over Ethiopia, and it's really concerning for refugees, especially family members of activists like myself who advocate against the Eritrean government. So I wouldn't give more details about where they are now and what's their situation, just for the sake of their safety. But it's my stepmom and my 4 siblings. The 2 of them, they were a year and a half and 3 years when I left, so I don't even know them very well now. So they're not at the refugee camp. They escaped. They walked for hours to be in a safe place. So even though they're not in the conflict zone now, they're out of that, and they're safe for now. But they're dying to leave the country and to come here. And I can't wait to reunite with them, and to see that they'll have a future here, especially the kids who are born in a war zone. They were born in between 1997 and 2001, 2002. So that was the time where we were in displacement, and just they've been displaced their entire life, and they're living in memories of war and conflict and displacement.
Wow. Okay. Well, we'll have to leave it there, but thank you so much. I have a prying personality, and I know how challenging some of these issues can be to talk about. And I know we've talked about that before. So thank you for your courage and bravery and willingness to be vulnerable and share your experiences with me and those of us in the audience. And of course, keep up your good work, your important studies at York, and all the work you're doing with private sponsorship. So thank you sincerely for sharing all your thoughts and wisdom with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for creating this opportunity for me to share my story and the story of Eritrean refugees, and for Betzedek, who's doing the amazing work, for Jayas, who's helping many refugees, and for Chai and Danny and many other people who are not member of the Betzedek committee, but doing an amazing job to sponsor Eritrean refugees. And like I said, if you want to get involved, if you want to help in any way you can, we are here, and we look forward to getting your support as well.
Great. Dawit, thank you so much again. Rabbi Steve, let me, turn it over to you to end the event.
I think I just want to reiterate something that you, David, said at the beginning, and that is when we talk about the number like 80 million, that number just seems so overwhelming. And one of the things that I appreciated about today, and Dawit, thank you for sharing your personal story. One of the things I appreciated about today, but then also it struck me that Canada's process of a family sponsorship really takes that big number and breaks it down to a human experience. And, you know, as I was talking about with Jewish values, it's like, you know, when we talk about these things, we tend to think of them disconnected actually from what we do sometimes. And I think that this work of connecting our values, Dawit, to your story and to your family story and to others through the help of Jais, is just a really, it's a profound way of taking these things seriously. And what we've heard today and what we'll learn more of in the future is the very real impact that we can have on other people, on other human beings. And that I just can't think of anything more inspirational than that. So thank you, Dawit. Thank you, David. Thank you, Jais. Thank you, Yaakov. Thank you to our committee. Thank you, everyone, for being here. We hope you have a good week, and we look forward to being able to share with you, God willing, soon, the successful news of having brought another family to Canada.